Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hello students, in chapter 11, which was force and pressure, you studied about different kinds of forces and one of them was friction. We also learned that friction is a force which always acts opposite to the action of the body, right? When suppose you are walking in the forward direction, the friction will push you backwards, right? It is generally perpendicular to the force of action. So let us start with what friction is. Let us give an introduction to friction. So students, any object moving over the surface of another object slows down when no external force is applied. For example, you are playing with a ball and you throw it away. After some time you will notice that the ball has stopped on its own. You have not stopped it by applying any force, but after some time it stops on its own. Why does this happen? There was no external force acting upon it which was visible to you. There was no visible force, right? It stopped on its own according to you, but it's not like that. Basically, friction acts in the opposite direction. For example, there is a ball which is moving in this direction. It will keep on moving, but after some time it will stop. This is because the friction, this was the force of action, right? This is how you applied force. But in this direction you will see friction will be acting just opposite to the motion of the ball. Hence, this friction stops the ball. We learn what friction is, how this friction is generated and how it is very important to us. Now, have you seen a moving ball on ground stopping after some time? I just gave you this reference that a ball moving on a ground stops after some time. For that matter, any object, if you throw any object, it will stop moving after some time, right? This is because of friction. Now, you must have seen people slipping on a banana peel. For example, this is a picture. This is the picture in front of you. A boy falls down when he steps on a banana peel. Why is this happening? Why is this ball falling down? This is because when a banana peel comes in between the leg and the ground, this banana peel reduces friction. We also learned that friction is a contact force. Basically, friction only occurs when there is contact between two surfaces. This was surface 1 and this was surface 2. The surface 1 was the sole of the boy's shoe and the surface 2 was ground. When the banana peel comes in between both the surfaces, it reduces friction and due to which the boy falls down. The friction is lost, hence the boy falls down because there is no friction. So, we slip on a banana peel, we slip when we step foot on a banana peel because the banana peel reduces friction completely. Then why is it difficult to walk on a smooth and wet floor? You know that if there is a smooth floor or there is a wet floor, for example, this is the floor and there is water present on it. If you try walking on it, the friction will be very less. Friction will be very less because there is water present in between your leg and the surface which reduces friction, which makes it smoother, hence friction is reduced. So this is a basic introduction in which the cases basically where you see friction around you in your daily life, right? So students, let us start with the force of friction. There is a picture in front of you. In the picture 1, there is a boy who is sliding the book from left to right. Right, there is a table in front of you and you are sliding a book from left to right. Right, students? Then what is happening? The book stops after 1 or 2 seconds. Right. Similarly, the boy pushes the book from right to left. Now in the opposite direction, what is happening? The book again stops after 1 to 2 seconds. So this friction basically, irrespective of the direction, acts just opposite to the action of force, right? This was in this direction the boy applied force. So the friction is seen in the opposite direction which stops down the book, which basically stops the book on the table. The book stops moving because of this friction. In this case, as the force of action was in this direction, the friction acts in the opposite direction and stops the book. So it does not matter what the direction of the action of force is, the force of friction will be always opposite to the direction of the force applied, right? So what does this activity tell us? That friction acts opposite to the applied force, right? This is one point that we note from this activity, that friction always acts in the opposite direction. In both the cases, the book was being thrown in different directions, in opposite directions. The friction was acting on both of them equally, because friction is always acting in the opposite direction, and it stops the motion. We'll understand how it stops the motion. Let us do that. Now, friction. If you apply force, we are basically explaining the activity. If you apply the force along the left, friction acts along the right. You notice that the force was in the left direction while the friction is in the right direction, right? If you apply the force along the right, the friction acts in the left direction. This again tells us that friction acts opposite to the applied force. This is the point that we're noticing again and again, and it is very important as well. In both the cases, force opposes the motion of the book. When you have thrown the book, the force, that is friction, that is being applied on its own, is always opposite to the motion of the book, which means that it is opposing the motion of the book, it is stopping the motion of the book, right? Now, the force of friction always opposes the book, as we just told you. Here, the force of friction acts between the surface of the book and the surface of the table. As I told you, friction is a contact force. Friction only acts when there are two substances touching each other. If you rub these objects, there will be friction present in between them. If I try to slide my hand like this, there will be friction in between both the hands, right? Irrespective of the force. And in this case, basically the friction was between the book and the table. So what did we learn? That friction is a contact force. It only happens when there is a contact between two substances, and friction always acts opposite to the motion, or always to the action of force, right? Always opposite to the direction of action of force, right, students? So what did we learn in this lecture? We basically understood what is the role played by friction in our surroundings, what happens, what are the general incidents, and what are some properties of friction. So students, let us start. We also I also have to tell you that friction always occurs when the two surfaces, for example, in the first lecture we saw that there was a book placed on a table, right? The book was stopped because of the contact between book and table, right? So the surfaces of book and the table, we always consider that there is a substance. If there is a substance, it has a smooth surface. Whatever we see, there is a pen, I have a pen with me, and I can see that the surface is pretty smooth. But when you see the magnified version of this pen only, the surface is not that smooth. Surface is like this. And for the table as well, the surface is like this only. So when these two layers, the first one, the pen, and the book, you can say the table, when the pen and table come in contact, these surfaces lock into each other, right? And hence there is the generation of friction. So this is how friction is generated. Now let's see how there are some factors which affect friction. Before that, let us understand what a spring balance is. Students, this is the spring balance, as you can see in the picture. Spring balance is a device used for measuring the force acting on an object. Spring balance is used to measure the force acting on an object. How can we do that with the help of a spring balance? Now let us see. It consists of a coiled spring. There is a coiled spring inside it. There is a coiled spring, right? Which is which is the indication of the force, which gets stretched when a force is applied. For example, if you apply some force on its terminal, you try to pull it, the spring will expand and let us know how much force is being applied, right? Now stretching of the spring is measured by a pointer. There is a pointer, 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. There is a pointer. This tells us what is the magnitude of the force, right? The reading on the scale gives us the magnitude of the force. So this is how a spring balance works. You apply some force, you hang something down a spring balance, the spring will expand and it will let us know what is the strength of the force that is being applied. Alright. Now students, let us see. There is an activity in front of you related to spring balance only, which will make you understand how a spring balance works. There is a brick in front of you, right? So you have tied a thread around the brick and you have tied the thread to the spring balance as well. Now what you do is, in the first case, you try to pull the spring balance so that the brick is moved, right? You try to notice the force until the brick does not move. For example, after some time you will see that the spring has expanded to 80. It has expanded up to 80. So the magnitude of force, which is friction, is 80 units. This friction is not allowing the brick to move. It is steady because of friction. So the force that is acting is friction, and the magnitude is the amount of force that is shown on the spring balance, right? Now in the second case, this case there was only brick. In the second case, you have wrapped the brick in a poly bag. Poly bag is present over the brick. There is a poly bag wrapped over a brick. Now you are again trying to pull it. Now what happens is, this poly bag reduces the friction between the ground and the brick, right? The poly bag has reduced the friction between the ground and the brick. Hence, it is now easy to pull the brick. So the friction is reduced. We can say that the new friction is F dash is 40 units. It is easier to pull the brick now because the friction has been reduced. The third case. In the third case, you wrap a jute bag over the brick. Jute bag over the brick. Around the brick, you can say, because you're covering the whole brick with the jute bag. Now you try to pull the spring balance again. You will see that this friction is more than the friction caused by poly bag. The poly bag was reducing the friction, but the jute bag has somewhat larger friction than the poly bag. So you can say that the friction caused by jute bag is 60 units, right? But it is still easier to pull the brick with the help of a covering such as a poly bag or a jute bag, instead of moving the brick alone, because there is this direct contact between the surface of brick and the ground. So students, what did we learn? That friction, what does the friction depend upon? It also depends on the surfaces, the properties of surfaces, how smooth the surface is, how much deformities are there on the surface of the substance. This tells us about the magnitude of friction also, right? There is another activity in front of you. This is the next activity, in which you see there are two students and there is an inclined surface. There are too many books kept here. These are the books, and this is the mark A. Now from mark A, the students are sliding a cell, and the cell moves from here to here. So let us say the distance covered is x and y, x plus y. Alright. So the distance covered by the cell is x plus y. Right, students? In the second case, they have kept a cloth. Right? There is a cloth present on the table now. Now they are sliding the cell again from the inclined surface. This is the mark A again, and here is the cell. The cell goes down and then moves up to this point only. This was point B, let's say, and this is point B dash, right? So what is happening? It covers the distance x the same, but the distance covered on the cloth is different, which is y dash. So what is the distance covered here? Distance covered is x plus y dash. Now we know that y is more than y dash, right? This length is much more than this length. So what does this tell you? That the cell moved very fast on the wooden surface, while it moved very slow and stopped earlier on the cloth. So this tells us that pencil cell covers different distances on different surfaces. So this also tells us that different surfaces provide different amount of friction, right? You're moving on a road and you're moving on sand. There are two examples. First one is you're moving on the sand, and the second one you're moving on the road. It will be difficult for you to move in the sand while moving on the road, because the friction caused by the sand is much more than the friction caused by the road. The road is comparatively smoother, hence we experience less friction on the road. while we experience much more friction when we walk in the sand. It is very difficult for us to walk in the sand, right? Because it causes much friction. Now students, what is the explanation? Friction caused by the irregularities on the two surfaces in contact. Friction is caused by the irregularity. For example, there is a picture in front of you in which there is a table and there is a book. It has been kept on the table. Now if we look at the magnified version, this is the magnified version of the contact of their surfaces. This is the surface of the book and this is the surface of the table. You see that there are irregularities. Now when these irregularities come in contact, they lock themselves. As I told you earlier as well, these surfaces lock into each other and hence the motion is stopped. No matter how smooth the surface looks like, but there are still irregularities on the surfaces of the substances. And more are the irregularities, more is the friction. If the surface is smoother, the friction will be less. If there are more deformities or irregularities, the friction will be more and more. Even those surfaces which appear very smooth have large number of minute irregularities on them. As I told you about the pen as well, this pen looks very smooth, but this pen also has a number of irregularities on its surface, right? Irregularities on the two surfaces lock into one another. These irregularities lock into one another. When we attempt to move any surface, for example, if I am trying to move this pen over my hand, it stops on its own. We have to apply a force to overcome the interlocking. Now let's see, I am sliding this pen but it has stopped on its own, right? Now what should I do to keep it moving? I still have to apply more and more force so that I can overcome the interlocking between the two surfaces, right? So the force that I apply must be stronger than the interlocking present in between the two surfaces. This is what I am telling you. That when we attempt to move any surface, we have to apply a force to overcome the interlocking, because this is the reason due to which the substance is stopping its motion. So we need to overcome the interlocking. On rough surfaces, there are a large number of irregularities. As I told you about sand and road, sand is very rough. So the force of friction is greater if the rough surface is involved. So as sand is very rough, it is not smooth. Hence, there is more and more friction. If you move in a forest which is full of grass, there also will be a good friction because of the irregularities present on the ground. While walking on the road, you do not experience that much of friction because it is smoother as compared to the forest or the sand. Right, students? So, what are the factors affecting friction? If we talk about the conclusion from here, the force of friction will increase if the two surfaces are pressed harder. If the two surfaces are pressed harder, if the force applied is perpendicular, then the friction will be very, very high. Right? The force of friction will increase if the two surfaces are pressed harder. Earlier, I was just sliding the pen. Now I am applying the force and sliding the pen. Now it will be very, very difficult for me to move the pen because I am applying the force on the pen as well. So it will not move as fast because the friction has now increased. It basically is a simple rule that you are applying a force and there is friction opposite to it. You increase the force, the friction will also be increased. Right? So what does this tell you? The force of friction will increase if the two surfaces are pressed harder. Correct? Then there is an example, a very simple example. You have a mat and you are trying to drag it. Right? You are trying to drag the mat. It will be easy for you to drag the mat. But if there is a person standing on the mat, will you be able to drag the mat now? No, because the force on the mat has now increased. The surface of the mat and the floor are being pressed harder. As the surfaces are being pressed harder, the interlocking gets stronger. Hence, it is very difficult to move these surfaces anymore. Right? So, the first factor is that force of friction will increase if the two surfaces are pressed harder. Right, students? Now, static and sliding friction. The force required to overcome a friction at instant an object starts moving from rest is a measure of static friction. What does this tell you? That there was a body which was at rest, right? Now you started moving it. Now the force required to overcome the friction basically the object is steady, right? I push it. Now the force applied by me on this pen to move it is the measure of static friction, right? So what does this tell you? The force required to overcome the friction at the instant an object starts moving from the rest position is measure of static friction. Basically, we are moving a static object which was not moving initially. When we push it, it starts moving. Now the force that was applied to overcome that static position, the force required to move that, the minimum force required to move that object is static friction. In the picture you can see that the box is steady and the boy is trying to push it, right? Now the force that he applies by which the box will move is static friction, right? On the other hand, the force required to keep an object moving with the same speed is the measure of sliding friction. In the last chapter you saw that a boy was basically using a stick to move the tire round and round, right? He was hitting the tire with the stick so that the tire kept moving. So what was he doing? He was applying a force that was equal to the friction. He was basically using sliding friction to keep the tire moving, right? He was continuously applying some force so as to keep the tire moving. So the force required to keep the object moving with the same speed is a measure of sliding friction. You are continuously overcoming the friction that is about to stop the object. You keep on applying force, you keep on increasing its speed, you keep it on the constant speed by applying force. Hence this kind of friction is known as sliding friction. In static friction you are just moving it from its static position, while in sliding friction you are keeping the object moving, right? So this is the difference between static and sliding friction. Now explanation, when the box starts sliding, there is a picture in front of you, right? When the box starts sliding, the contact points on the surface, there was the box and there is the ground. Now this is the area where we can see the contact. Now the contact points of the box and the ground do not get enough time to lock into the contact points of the floor. These points do not get time enough to lock into the contact points of the floor. Hence the box starts moving. So the sliding friction is slightly smaller than the static friction. It is easier to move a moving body. Now students, I will take the tire example again. The boy was hitting the tire, right? Now the tire is already moving. So there is the presence of static friction already. The force of static friction is already present there, right? It is already moving. You only need to apply some force that keeps it moving. You do not have to start from a static point. You do not have to move it initially. You just have to keep it moving. So this tells us that sliding friction is slightly smaller than the static friction. What does it tell you? That the boy started pushing the box, right? When it was the first time when he started pushing, he required much more force to make it move. But once it has moved, the boy can easily push it around for longer distances, right? So this tells us that sliding friction is slightly smaller than the static friction, and you find it somewhat easier to move the box already in motion than to get it started. It is difficult to move a box that is static than to move a box that is already moving. So this tells us that sliding friction is lesser than static friction, right students? So this is the explanation basically of the box activity. When the boy started pushing it, when it was static, the boy required much more force, but once it started moving, it was the force required was only required to slide the box, right? There was a requirement of lesser force, hence sliding friction is less than static friction. The friction that a body experiences during moving is lesser than the friction that is experienced when it is static, right students? So this was the explanation. So we learned about the factors affecting friction, and the major factor was the contact and the surfaces of the substances that come in contact. Thank you for your attention students.